They heard it first as a faint, rhythmic pinging transmitted through the hull. The sound came from above, from somewhere on the surface, a steady electronic pulse that seemed to follow them no matter which direction Kapitänleutnant Lehmann-Willenbrock ordered his boat to turn. It was March 23, 1944, and U-96 was running submerged at 120 meters depth in the North Atlantic, roughly 400 miles west of the Hebrides. The boat had been underwater for 6 hours, evading a patrol aircraft that had forced them down just after dawn. Standard procedure called for remaining submerged until nightfall, then surfacing to recharge batteries and ventilate the boat. But this sound, this persistent pinging that grew neither louder nor softer regardless of their maneuvering, was something the crew had never encountered before. The hydrophone operator, Obermatt Klaus Fischer, pressed his headphones tighter against his ears and concentrated. He had been listening to Allied sonar for 3 years, had learned to distinguish between British and American active sonar signatures, could identify the distinctive sound of destroyer propellers at ranges exceeding 8,000 meters. But this was different. The pulse pattern was too regular, too mechanical, and it wasn't moving. Or rather, it was moving with them, maintaining a constant bearing above their position regardless of course changes. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Lehmann-Willenbrock stood in the control room, water condensation dripping from the overhead pipes onto his worn leather jacket. The air inside the boat was thick with humidity, carbon dioxide levels rising with each passing hour submerged. 44 men breathed the same air, their bodies generating heat and moisture in the confined steel tube that measured just over 67 meters from bow to stern. The boat smelled of diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, mildew, and the chemical toilets that could only be flushed when depth and sea conditions permitted. This was normal. Every U-boat crew lived with these conditions. What was not normal was the sound Fisher kept reporting, the electronic pulse that seemed to know exactly where they were. The commander ordered another course change. Southwest, then after 15 minutes, northwest. The sound remained constant. He ordered the boat taken deeper, to 150 meters, approaching the Type 7C's maximum safe operating depth of 220 meters. The pinging continued, transmitted clearly through the water and the hull despite the increased depth. Something on the surface was tracking them with a precision that defied everything German submariners understood about Allied anti-submarine warfare capabilities. In March 1944, the Battle of the Atlantic had reached what historians would later recognize as its decisive phase. The Wolfpack tactics that had devastated Allied convoys in 1942 and early 1943 were no longer viable. Allied air coverage now extended across the entire Atlantic through a combination of land-based long-range patrol aircraft, escort carriers accompanying convoys, and increased aerial refueling capabilities. The so-called Black Gap, the mid-Atlantic area beyond the range of shore-based aircraft where U-boats had operated with relative impunity, had effectively ceased to exist. German U-boat command, the Befehlshaber der U-Boot, or BDU, had adapted tactics accordingly. Boats now spent more time submerged, surfacing only briefly at night to recharge batteries and transmit position reports. They travelled in dispersed patrol lines rather than concentrated wolf packs. They avoided engagement with well-defended convoys unless circumstances were overwhelmingly favourable. Survival had become as important as sinking, tonnage. The men who served aboard U-boats in 1944 knew the statistics that their commanders tried to hide. Of the 40,000 men who would eventually serve in the U-boat service during the war, 30,000 would die. That was a casualty rate of 75%, the highest of any military service in any nation during World War II. But even experienced crews who understood the dangers maintained certain fundamental assumptions about underwater operations. A submerged U-boat was difficult to detect. Surface ships could locate submarines using active sonar, sending acoustic pulses through the water and listening for echoes. But this required the hunting vessel to be relatively close, typically within 2,000 meters. Aircraft posed a greater threat but only when the submarine was on or near the surface. Once a boat was deep, once it had successfully evaded the initial detection and gone below 100 meters, the crew believed they had achieved a form of sanctuary. The hunters above would lose contact. The submarine could move away, change course, and eventually surface at a safe distance. This was the tactical doctrine taught at the U-boat training facilities in Pillow and Neustadt. This was the operational experience accumulated through thousands of war patrols. The technology that German submariners relied upon for underwater warfare had evolved considerably since the war's beginning. The Type 7C U-boat, the most common variant in service by 1944, incorporated lessons learned from earlier models and from combat experience. The pressure hull could withstand depths to 220 meters, though most commanders avoided going below 180 meters except in emergencies. The electric motors that powered the boat while submerged drew power from 2 battery banks, each consisting of 62 lead-acid cells weighing approximately 165 kilograms apiece. At economical speed of 2 knots, the batteries could sustain submerged operations for approximately 65 hours. At higher speeds, the endurance decreased dramatically. Running at 4 knots drained the batteries in about 10 hours. German hydrophone equipment had improved throughout the war. The GHG passive sonar system, Gruppenhochgerät, allowed trained operators to detect propeller noise at considerable distances under favorable conditions. The system used a circular array of hydrophones mounted in the bow, providing bearing information accurate to within a few degrees. Experienced operators like Fischer could identify specific ship types by their acoustic signatures, could estimate range based on sound intensity, and could track multiple contacts simultaneously. This equipment gave U-boat commanders critical information about surface threats. It allowed them to avoid destroyers, to plot intercept courses on merchant vessels, and to monitor the movements of hunting groups trying to locate them. What the equipment could not do, what no German submarine technology in 1944 could accomplish, was identify the source of the persistent pinging that Fischer reported from U-96's hydrophone station. The bearing remained constant at approximately 0 degrees, directly above the boat. The signal strength did not vary with their depth changes or course alterations. Most puzzling, there was no accompanying propeller noise, no machinery sounds, no acoustic signature of a surface vessel maintaining position overhead. Whatever was transmitting this signal was doing so without the acoustic emissions that should accompany a ship holding station. Lehmann-Willenbrock considered his options. The batteries were at 60% capacity. He had air for another 8 hours at current CO2 levels, longer if they reduced activity and lay quiet. He could continue evading, burning battery power and consuming air while this unknown device tracked them. Or he could ascend to periscope depth, risk exposure, and attempt to identify what was following them. The tactical manual provided no guidance for this situation. Nothing in his training or combat experience explained a stationary acoustic source that maintained perfect tracking despite evasive maneuvers. He ordered the boat to proceed northwest at 3 knots, while he consulted with his officers in the cramped space that served as the commander's quarters. The weapon-tracking U-96 was a Sonobuoy, specifically an AN SSQ-1 radio Sonobuoy, one of the most significant technological developments in anti-submarine warfare to be deployed during World War II. The device had been developed by the United States beginning in 1942 in response to a critical problem facing Allied anti-submarine operations. Patrol aircraft could locate U-boats on the surface using radar, could force them to dive with their presence, and could attack with depth charges if they arrived while the submarine was still surfacing or diving. But once a U-boat was deep, once it had successfully submerged before the aircraft arrived, the hunters lost contact. The submarine could move in any direction underwater. By the time surface vessels arrived to prosecute the contact, the U-boat might be kilometers away from its last known position. The Sonobuoy solved this problem through elegant simplicity. The device consisted of a hydrophone suspended at a predetermined depth, typically 30 meters, connected to a radio transmitter floating on the surface. When dropped from an aircraft, the Sonobuoy would deploy automatically. The hydrophone would descend to its operating depth, while the surface float remained on the waves. The hydrophone would listen for submarine noises, machinery sounds, propeller cavitation, any acoustic signature that indicated a submerged vessel. When it detected such sounds, the radio transmitter would broadcast the information back to the aircraft or to surface vessels equipped with appropriate receivers. The transmission used VHF frequencies around 70 MHz, providing reliable range of approximately 30 to 40 kilometers, depending on atmospheric conditions and receiving aircraft altitude. The AN SSQ-1 had been rushed into production in 1943 after successful testing demonstrated its capabilities. The Naval Research Laboratory had developed the basic technology, but practical deployment required solving numerous engineering challenges. The device needed to survive being dropped from aircraft flying at speeds exceeding 200 knots. It needed to function in seawater, which corroded electronics and degraded battery performance. It needed to provide consistent acoustic detection across varying ocean conditions, water temperatures, and background noise levels. Most critically, it needed sufficient battery endurance to remain operational long enough to be tactically useful. The production model that entered service in late 1943 had a battery life of approximately 3 to 4 hours under normal operating conditions. The hydrophone had a detection range of roughly 1 to 2 kilometers, depending on the target's acoustic signature and ambient noise conditions. A quiet submarine moving slowly generated minimal propeller cavitation and machinery noise, making detection more difficult. A submarine attempting to escape at higher speeds created significantly more noise, extending the detection range. The Sonobuoy transmitted on a single frequency, which meant that multiple buoys could be deployed in a pattern, each broadcasting on a different frequency, allowing operators to triangulate a submarine's position based on which buoys detected the target and the relative signal strength from each. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By March 1944, Allied patrol aircraft routinely carried Sonobuoys as standard equipment. The consolidated B-24 Liberator maritime patrol variants carried up to 16 Sonobuoys in addition to their depth charges, radar equipment, and other anti-submarine weapons. The Lockheed PV-1 Ventura carried 8. Even smaller aircraft like the Grumman TBF Avenger, operating from escort carriers, carried 4 to 6 Sonobuoys. The deployment procedure was straightforward. When radar or visual observation indicated a U-boat diving, the aircraft would drop Sonobuoys in a pattern around the submarine's last known position. The typical pattern was a square or triangle with buoys spaced approximately 2 to 3 kilometers apart. As the Sonobuoys deployed and began transmitting, operators aboard the aircraft would monitor multiple radio frequencies simultaneously, listening for the characteristic sounds of a submarine's machinery or propeller noise. What made this technology particularly devastating from the German perspective was its persistence. An aircraft could force a U-boat to dive, deploy Sonobuoys, and then orbit at a distance while monitoring the transmissions. The submarine crew, accustomed to aircraft leaving after the initial attack or after exhausting their depth charges, would eventually attempt to move away from the danger area. But their movement would be detected by the Sonobuoys. The aircraft could then vector surface vessels to the submarine's current position, or could return to drop additional depth charges with much greater accuracy than blind attacks based on estimated positions. The U-boat, which had believed itself safe once it reached depth, remained under continuous observation. U-96 remained submerged for another 4 hours after Lehmann-Willenbrock's consultation with his officers. The pinging continued. The battery level dropped to 40%, then 35%. Carbon dioxide accumulated in the air. Men moved slowly, conserving oxygen, speaking in whispers not from fear of detection, but from the lethargy that comes with breathing air that has been cycled through 44 pairs of lungs for 10 hours. The commander made his decision at 1400 hours. They would ascend to periscope depth, conduct a quick observation, and if the surface appeared clear, they would blow tanks and surface to recharge batteries. The alternative was to remain submerged until the batteries died completely, at which point they would be forced to surface regardless of tactical conditions. The boat rose slowly, maintaining minimum speed to preserve battery power. At 60 meters depth, Fisher reported the pinging had stopped. At 40 meters, he heard propeller noises bearing 030 degrees, twin screws, diesel engines, probably a corvette or frigate moving at approximately 12 knots. At periscope depth, Lehmann-Willenbrock raised the search periscope for a 5-second observation. He saw the hunting vessel, identified it as a British Flower-class corvette, approximately 4,000 meters, distant and closing. More significantly, he saw an aircraft, a twin-engine type he recognized as a Wellington, orbiting at low altitude roughly 3 kilometers to the north. The aircraft was not hunting. It was observing, maintaining station, clearly aware of the U-boat's position despite the submarine having been submerged and maneuvering for over 10 hours. Lehmann-Willenbrock ordered the boat back down to 120 meters. He changed course to southeast, increased speed to 4 knots despite the battery drain, and prepared his crew for depth charge attack. The corvette arrived overhead within 30 minutes. The first pattern of depth charges detonated at 15:30 hours. 4 explosions, close enough that the concussions knocked tools off their brackets and shattered light bulbs throughout the boat. Cork insulation fell from the overhead. Men braced themselves against the hull frames as the boat pitched violently. Fisher reported the corvette was turning for another run. The second pattern was closer. One charge detonated near enough that the pressure wave buckled a section of external plating. Water began leaking through a failed valve seal in the aft torpedo room. The attack continued for 2 hours. 16 depth charges in 4 separate attacks. U-96 survived because the boat was well built, because the crew was experienced, and because even with Sonobuoy guidance, depth charge attacks remained imprecise. The weapons detonated at preset depths, typically 30 to 60 meters, and relied on creating a pressure wave that would crush a submarine's hull if the explosion occurred close enough. But close enough meant within 15 to 20 meters. A depth charge detonating 50 meters away might shake a boat violently but cause no critical damage. The corvette's commander was dropping his weapons based on Sonobuoy data that provided bearing and approximate range, but could not give precise depth or exact position. He was putting his charges in the right area, but the ocean provided the submarine with 3-dimensional space to evade. At 1700 hours, with batteries nearly exhausted and damage mounting, Lehmann-Willenbrock made the decision that many U-boat commanders faced in 1944. He ordered the boat to surface. They would fight on the surface if necessary, using their deck gun and anti-aircraft weapons, or they would scuttle the boat if the situation was hopeless. Surfacing with a hostile corvette nearby and an aircraft overhead was surrender or suicide, but remaining submerged was certain death as the batteries died and the boat lost all maneuvering capability. U-96 came up at 1720 hours. The crew began emerging from the conning tower hatch before the boat had fully surfaced, knowing that seconds mattered. Gunners scrambled to man the 2-centimeter anti-aircraft guns. The diesel engines coughed, caught, and roared to life. The corvette was visible 3,000 meters to the northeast, turning toward them at full speed. The Wellington arrived first. It came in from the west, descending to attack altitude. Lehmann-Willenbrock saw it approaching and ordered his anti-aircraft crews to commence firing. The twin 2-centimeter guns opened up, their distinctive hammering sound carrying across the water. Tracer rounds arced toward the aircraft. The Wellington held its course, steady despite the flak. At 800 meters distance, it released 4 depth charges in a stick pattern, aimed to bracket the U-boat. The charges hit the water ahead of the submarine, detonating in a line that threw up massive columns of white water. One charge exploded within 30 meters of the bow, close enough that the pressure wave lifted the entire forward section of the submarine partially out of the water. Plating buckled. The forward torpedo tube outer doors were jammed. 2 men on the bridge were knocked unconscious by the concussion, but U-96 remained afloat. The pressure hull held. And critically, the diesel engines continued running, charging the batteries that would allow the boat to dive again if they survived the next few minutes. The corvette closed to 2,000 meters and opened fire with its 4-inch main gun. The first round fell short, throwing up a waterspout 50 meters ahead of the submarine. The second round was long by a similar margin. The British gunners were finding their range. Lehmann-Willenbrock ordered full speed, turning the boat to present the smallest possible target, while simultaneously positioning to bring his own 8.8 centimeter deck gun to bear. The U-boat's deck gun crew reached their weapon and began the process of removing the spray shield and loading a round. This required exposing themselves on the open deck, while the British corvette and the circling aircraft could engage them with direct fire. It was murderous work. The Wellington made another pass, this time strafing the submarine with machine gun fire. Bullets struck the conning tower and the pressure hull, ricocheting off the thick steel but forcing the anti-aircraft crews to take cover. One gunner was hit in the shoulder, the bullet penetrating between his ribs. He remained at his weapon, continuing to fire at the aircraft despite the wound. The tactical situation was impossible. U-96 could not outgun a corvette in surface combat. The boat's 8.8 centimeter gun was designed for engaging merchant vessels, not warships. The corvette's 4-inch gun had longer range, higher rate of fire, and was mounted on a stable platform rather than on a submarine's deck that sat low in the water. The aircraft would continue to attack, forcing the U-boat to either dive or remain on the surface and be destroyed by the corvette's gunfire. Lehmann-Willenbrock recognized this within seconds of reaching the surface. He made the only decision that offered any chance of survival. He ordered the boat to dive immediately, despite the batteries having charged for less than 15 minutes. U-96 submerged at 17:35 hours, disappearing beneath the surface just as the corvette's third salvo arrived. The shells fell where the submarine had been seconds before. The boat went to 100 meters depth, turned south, and proceeded at 2 knots to conserve what little battery power they had accumulated during their brief time on the surface. Fisher reported hearing additional splashes above them. The British were dropping more Sonobuoys. The pinging resumed within minutes, that same steady electronic pulse that had tracked them all day. The corvette's propellers could be heard on the hydrophones, circling above them, maintaining contact through the acoustic devices that German submariners were only now beginning to understand. The boat remained submerged through the night. The corvette was joined by a second escort vessel around 2100 hours. Both ships maintained station overhead, occasionally dropping single depth charges, not attempting to destroy the submarine but rather keeping it submerged, preventing it from surfacing to recharge batteries or to ventilate the hull. The tactic was brutally effective. By midnight, the battery level was at 15%. The air quality had deteriorated to the point where men were gasping, their bodies starved for oxygen. Carbon dioxide levels were approaching the threshold where crew members would begin losing consciousness. Lehmann-Willenbrock ordered all non-essential personnel to lie in their bunks to reduce oxygen consumption. The control room crew wore Draeger Tauchreta emergency breathing apparatus, drawing on the potash cartridges that chemically absorbed carbon dioxide from exhaled breath. At 0 to 200 hours on March 24th, with batteries at 8% and air quality critical, U-96 surfaced for the second time. The crew knew what awaited them. They had discussed it during the long night underwater. Surrender was the only realistic option. Fighting would result in the boat being sunk with all hands. Scuttling would at least allow the crew to abandon ship before the boat went down, giving them a chance to be picked up by the British vessels. Lehmann-Willenbrock gave the orders to open the seawater valves, to set demolition charges in the bow and stern torpedo rooms, and to prepare to abandon ship. The crew emerged onto the deck in the darkness, wearing their life vests, carrying nothing. 44 men climbed out of the conning tower hatch and stood on the submarine's deck as the boat settled lower in the water. The demolition charges detonated at 0 to 2:15 hours. The explosions were muffled by the water flooding into the forward and aft compartments, but the effect was immediate. The bow began to sink, angling downward as the torpedo room flooded. The stern rose as the boat pivoted on its center of buoyancy. Men jumped into the cold, Atlantic water, swimming away from the submarine as it went down. The corvettes approached, throwing lines and scrambling nets over their sides. British sailors pulled German submariners from the water, 44 men who hours earlier had been enemies but who now were simply cold, exhausted survivors of a battle that had lasted nearly 24 hours. U-96 sank in water too deep for salvage, approximately 3,000 meters, taking with it all classified materials, code books, and equipment that might have intelligence value. Lehmann-Willenbrock and his crew were taken to Britain, interrogated, and eventually sent to prisoner of war camps in Canada, where they would remain until the war ended. During interrogation, British intelligence officers showed particular interest in the crew's awareness of Sonobuoys. The Germans acknowledged hearing the persistent pinging but had not understood what was tracking them. They had assumed it was some new type of sonar, perhaps deployed from the corvette, though they couldn't explain why it remained stationary above their position regardless of their maneuvers. When informed that the device was an expendable acoustic buoy dropped by the aircraft, multiple crew members expressed disbelief. The interrogation reports documented the Germans' reaction to learning about Sonobuoy technology. One officer stated that if aircraft could deploy such devices and track submarines for hours, then submerged evasion was no longer a viable defensive tactic. Another crew member, when told that the Sonobuoys had battery lives of 3 to 4 hours and that aircraft routinely carried multiple units, calculated that a single patrol aircraft could maintain acoustic contact with a submarine through an entire day by deploying new buoys as old ones expired. The strategic implications were clear to these experienced submariners. The fundamental assumption that depth provided sanctuary had been invalidated. A submarine forced to dive could no longer escape simply by moving away from the last known position. It would remain under observation as long as the hunting forces maintained their Sonobuoy barrier. This psychological revelation, the understanding that their tactical doctrine was obsolete, was shared by thousands of German submariners during the final 18 months of the war. As Sonobuoy deployment became standard procedure for Allied anti-submarine aircraft, U-boat survival rates declined precipitously. In 1944, 91 U-boats were destroyed in the Atlantic. In the first 4 months of 1945, before Germany's surrender, another 75 boats were sunk. Many of these losses involved Sonobuoy-guided attacks. The technology did not guarantee a kill on every contact. Submarines still escaped through luck, through crew skill, through the imprecision of depth charge attacks. But the survival rate dropped from roughly 50% in early 1943 to below 20% by late 1944. German naval intelligence eventually obtained information about Sonobuoys through multiple sources. Wreckage from downed Allied aircraft sometimes included the devices. Interrogation of captured Allied aircrew provided operational details. German listening stations intercepted the VHF transmissions from deployed Sonobuoys, allowing analysts to study the signal characteristics and transmission protocols. But understanding the technology did not provide an effective countermeasure. German engineers proposed various solutions. Submarines could be equipped with sensors to detect Sonobuoy radio transmissions, giving crews warning that they were being tracked. Boats could carry devices to jam or spoof the acoustic sensors. New hull coatings might reduce the acoustic signature. None of these solutions reached operational deployment before the war ended. The engineering challenges were substantial. The resource requirements were beyond Germany's industrial capacity in 1944 and 1945, and the strategic situation did not permit the months of testing and refinement that new technologies required. The Allied development and deployment of Sonobuoys represented a perfect example of how industrial capacity and technological innovation combined to solve tactical problems in modern warfare. The United States identified a specific weakness in anti-submarine operations, the loss of contact when U-boats submerged. American engineers designed a solution that was technically feasible, practically deployable, and economically viable to produce in large quantities. Production facilities manufactured tens of thousands of Sonobuoys. Training programs taught aircrew how to deploy them effectively and how to interpret the acoustic data they provided. Tactical doctrine evolved to incorporate the new capability with standardized deployment patterns and coordination procedures between aircraft and surface vessels. Germany lacked the industrial capacity to respond with equivalent technological development. The nation's factories were focused on producing existing designs in insufficient quantities to meet frontline needs. Resources were devoted to wonder weapons like the Type XXI submarine, which incorporated advanced features including greatly increased battery capacity, streamlined hull design for improved underwater speed, and snorkel breathing tubes that allowed diesel engine operation while submerged. But the Type XXI did not reach operational deployment in meaningful numbers before the war ended. Only 2 boats completed war patrols, neither sinking any Allied vessels. The technology that might have restored some viability to U-boat operations came too late, and in too few numbers to matter. The story of U-96's final patrol, tracked for hours by devices the crew did not understand and could not escape, was repeated hundreds of times across the Atlantic during 1944 and 1945. Each boat that encountered Sonobuoys faced the same cruel revelation. The tactics they had trained in, the operational doctrine that emphasized submerged evasion, the fundamental belief that depth provided safety, all proved inadequate against technology they had not anticipated. The psychological impact extended beyond the immediate tactical situation. Submariners who had volunteered for U-boat service, who had accepted the known risks of underwater warfare, who had survived multiple patrols through skill and luck, now understood that survival was largely beyond their control. If an aircraft forced them down and deployed Sonobuoys, their position would be known to enemy forces for hours. Surface vessels would be vectored to their location. Depth charge attacks would continue until the submarine was destroyed, or until the crew surrendered, or until the boat's batteries died and forced an involuntary surface. There was no skill-based solution, no tactical maneuver that reliably defeated this capability. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.